Hey everyone, how's it going? Today we're going to start out by talking about the Gloster Meteor, one of the earliest jet fighters that saw military service, and the only Allied jet fighter that actually saw any kind of service during the Second World War, bearing a name that is both awesome and kind of unfortunate, in that when you think of a meteor, you think of a flaming rock hurling towards the ground. The meteor began its development all the way back in the late 1930s and into 1940, with initial work on British jet engines by Power Jets, leading to tester engines in the Power Jets WU and the first British jet engine to take to the air in the Power Jets W1. As these engines developed and were utilized in early experimental aircraft, like the Gloster E.2839, the British Air Ministry began seriously looking at jet engines for near-future military applications. Their potential was no longer just hypothetical. Their potential was real, and they wanted to start development early. However, early jet engines were incredibly finicky, consuming a lot of fuel, not providing an amazing amount of thrust, and overall just being very sensitive. As a result, it was decided at an early stage that Britain's first production model jet fighter should be a twin-engine fighter that had a relatively large frame. Two engines would give them the thrust and top speed that they wanted, and the larger frame would be able to hold the fuel that the engines practically inhaled. This eventually resulted in the Gloster Meteor. Now, going over the development of the Meteor can and probably will eventually be a video of its own, as there's quite a lot to go over. So instead, we'll focus in on one specific element of its development early on, and that's a hiccup in the project that occurred in 1942. While Power Jets designed the jet engines that were to be used on the Meteor, actual production of them was subcontracted out to Rover, a car manufacturing company founded all the way back in 1878, and their production of the Power Jets engines suffered from significant delays and shortages, which delayed the initial flight of the Meteor by about a year. Because the Meteor used two jet engines as per the initial request, Gloucester needed double the engines before the Meteor could take to the air. This production shortage led to a desire in the Air Ministry for a single-engine jet fighter that at the very least could be used until production could ramp up and meet the needs of the Meteor. Adding to this was the fact that by 1942, even though jet engines were still in their relative infancy, their potential was increasing, and it seemed like a single-engine jet fighter could have sufficient thrust and high performance. So in mid-1942, specification E.542 was created for a single-engine jet fighter, with a top speed upwards of 485 miles an hour, a service ceiling upwards of 47,000 feet, and an armament of at least two 20mm cannons. And to this specification, who else but Gloucester presented the predecessor to our subject for today that quickly grew into our subject, and that subject is this. This is the Gloster E144, also known as the Gloster Ace. The predecessor, known as the Gloster E.542, and also known as the Gloster Ace, was approved to commence designing and other work on July 3, 1942. But in an effort to spread the love, in a sense, and allow Gloucester to focus more attention on projects that were considered to be more important, the Air Ministry initially didn't actually give design work to Gloucester. Gloucester, and specifically designer Wilfred George Carter, came up with the Ace design and provided to the Air Ministry some initial specs, but the Air Ministry decided that the Meteor project was overall more important, and that Gloucester should focus their efforts on that. So they decided that Armstrong Whitworth, who happened to be owned by Hawker Siddeley Aircraft alongside Gloster, should be the ones that would handle the project. And for a very short period of time, Armstrong Whitworth did technically head the project, but Gloster would protest this decision, with Carter himself writing to the Air Ministry to complain. Just a couple weeks after this letter, and after chairman of Hawker Siddeley, Frank Spriggs, communicated to the Air Ministry that he preferred that Gloster head the project, the Air Ministry acquiesced and gave control back to Carter and Gloster. The project back in their hands, Gloster provided to the Air Ministry some initial estimated specs after they slightly revised their initial design. They would estimate a top speed upwards of 520 miles an hour, a service ceiling upwards of 48,000 feet, and a gross weight of 7,750 pounds. This would shortly thereafter be revised to over 8,000 pounds, but the overall design was good enough, and 3 prototypes would be ordered in late January 1943. While I couldn't really find more exact details or even an exact image of the accepted design, what we do know, in addition to the specs I provided just seconds ago, it had a wingspan of 10.7 meters, it would have either a Halford H1 or one of the Power Jet's engines with around 3,000 foot-pounds of thrust, and in all likelihood it would have a high T-tail, and a general layout that resembled this or this, a parallel project called the Gloster rocket, and an early drawing of the E.542's successor, respectively. By April 1943, a small-scale wind tunnel tester model started seeing use, and by November or December 1943, construction began on the first prototypes. However, that construction wouldn't take place for very long, though, and by February 1944, the E.542 design was de facto cancelled, and in its place, receiving a new contract, would be a similar but still different design also from Gloster. This little shift took place due to several possible reasons. For one, the production issues with the Power Jet's engines would be resolved after Rolls-Royce would take some of their production work, which gave the Meteor more of the engines it needed, which then took away one of the reasons for the E.542 to even exist. Additionally, Halford and de Havilland were working on an upgraded version of the H1 known as the H2, which was a little bit larger dimensionally and a good 33% heavier, and Rolls-Royce was working on a new jet engine known as the Rolls-Royce Nene. Both of these engines were believed to be too large to fit under wing on the Meteor, so this signaled once again the need for a potential single-engine jet fighter that would use either of these 2 new jet engines. And once again, Gloster decided to fill this need with a modification of the E.542 known as the E144, or once again just the Ace. The E144 was both similar and different from the E542, sharing a similar overall layout, but scaled up and modified in some smaller ways. And we do actually have some more definitive measurements for it, and boy do I love numbers. Initially, those numbers were a bit more loose, though, as the initial design was not set in stone and would go through several revisions. First, there was the P171 and P172, which both utilized some version of the Halford H1 engine and projected speeds upwards of 600 miles an hour. These would then be refined into the P174, outfit with the Halford H2 and with projected speeds upwards of 600 miles an hour, and this would be even further refined into the P175, which effectively then became the initial basis for the E144 prototype. Measuring in at 11.6 meters long, 11 meters wide, and between 3.56 and 5.6 meters tall, The E144, the new Ace, was a bit larger than its predecessor, and overall featured a rather sleek and appealing design, made almost entirely of metal, with some wood being used for insulation purposes. Up in the nose of the Ace would be its main armament, a set of 4 20mm cannons. This was a noted and requested by the Air Ministry improvement over the P-174 design that had just 2 20mm cannons in an effort to reduce weight. Just behind the nose and armament would be the cockpit with a bubble-style canopy that would give the pilot excellent vision. Just below and behind him would be a pair of air intakes, extending out from either side of the fuselage. This overall, when viewed from the top and bottom, made the E144 look remarkably wide for its size, and this increased width was at least partially caused by their choice of powerhouse. Instead of going with the nose-mounted air intake, as was seen on the earlier Gloster E2839, they presumably wanted something that would allow them to put weaponry in the nose. Now, how big these air intakes ended up being, though, depended on which engine they decided to go with. The Halford H2 would be able to utilize smaller, shorter, more triangular intakes that could blend in with the wing and the wing root, whereas the Rolls-Royce Nene would need a bit larger, more rounded air intakes. It was determined relatively early on that this difference in air intake styles meant that the E144 couldn't simply swap between the two engines as needed for testing, so distinct aircraft would need to be made for each engine. And since the larger focus of the project was the Rolls-Royce Nene, the eventual first prototype would have those larger, more rounded air intakes. Moving back to the tail, the control surfaces would be rather standard looking, aside from the fact that the vertical surface was slightly in front of the end of the tail, done so for control and spin recovery purposes. All in all, with an engine that was projected to output around 5,000 foot-pounds of thrust and had a gross weight of nearly 12,000 pounds, the projected top speed of this design sat upwards of 600 miles an hour. Even though the E144 specification had been officially introduced in early to mid-1944, and Gloucester had received contracts for several prototypes, and the anticipated first aircraft completion date was by mid to late 1945, the priority for the project quickly fell off a cliff, and this severely slowed progress on it. As previously mentioned, the engine shortage the Meteor experienced early in its development had been solved, and work on the Meteor had progressed to the point that on July 27, 1944, they would see active military service for the first time. While the E144 still had merit to it, considering that it promised speed that was greater than the Meteor with half the engines, this merit was reduced significantly after the first flight of the prototype de Havilland Vampire on September 20th, 1943. While its performance also was less than the estimated performance of the E144, the fact that it was quite far ahead of that project put the Vampire at a significant advantage. These factors ended up delaying the completion of the first prototype by about 2 years, and it wasn't until 1947 that the now kind of unnecessary E144 was loaded up and shipped off to Boscombe Down for testing. It was here that the E144 would encounter a rather bizarre and kind of hilarious accident. Of all the things that delay aircraft projects, from engine shortages to personnel shortages, to the factory making them being damaged, to political infighting, probably one of the strangest and least fitting delays I've ever read about comes from the Ace project, and the first prototype would be irreparably damaged by a car accident. And no, it wasn't damaged by a rogue vehicle on the runway, which admittedly would be hilarious in its own right, and it wasn't damaged after crashing into a parked plane or something like that. Instead, on the way to Boss Calm Down, the E144 rode on a trailer, and while driving downhill, the trailer jackknifed and threw the plane off of it and caused horrible damage, leading to it being written off entirely. Luckily for Gloucester, though, the second prototype was nearly finished, and its completion would be accelerated as a result of this accident, and by late 1947, it was successfully delivered. Initial taxiing trials on it were rather poor, though, with the nose wheel causing significant issues, which further delayed its initial flight. But by March 9, 1948, the Ace finally took to the air, and its overall performance was mixed, if perhaps promising. With a top speed of 620 miles an hour, the Ace actually showcased excellent top speed that was above that of the de Havilland Vampire and the Meteor. But this excellent speed was marred by the fact that its handling was considered to be quite poor. In fact, at least according to test pilot Bill Waterton, the Ace was so lacking in engine power and handling that he gave it a new nickname, the Gloster Gormless. Gormless in British slang basically means stupid, foolish, or clumsy. Waterton further claimed that the Ace's controls were overly heavy, especially at higher speeds, and that the aircraft overall was way too heavy for its engine. At the very least, though, when you consider that its top speed was 620 miles an hour, it really doesn't seem like it was too heavy for its engine. If it was, you would expect the top speed to suffer significantly, but that doesn't seem to have been the case. There may have been a good reason for this little discrepancy, though, and an argument made over on Dinger's aviation pages sounds pretty compelling. He speculates that the Ace Waterton flew was instead outfitted with an earlier, less powerful pre-production version of the Nene engine, which would easily explain his perception that the engine was not strong enough. As for those control issues, though, those were real and they actually needed to be remedied, and the tail surface would be modified in late 1948, early 1949, and it would resemble more of a T-tail, and doing this did improve control. However, by this point, with the Meteor well established and the Vampire now well established as well, and other more advanced designs in the works, there was basically 0 points in the Ace project continuing, or at least continuing as a prospective fighter, and as a result, past 1949, the only 2 existing E144s were used as testbed aircraft, and by the end of 1951, both of them would be scrapped. So ultimately, for the E144, considering how it eventually performed, would it have actually made it and been accepted if it wasn't delayed and placed on low priority? Personally, I actually think so. 620 miles an hour for an early jet fighter was quite impressive, and it was on just one engine to boot. Perhaps in an alternate universe, the Meteor would have been the forgotten jet fighter, and the Ace would have been an icon. But due to delays, the progress of other projects, and in small part a jackknife trailer, the Ace ended up fading away and became largely forgotten. Alright, and with that, we're going to go ahead and end for today. So, thank you all for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Now, random question. Is there any kind of thing you see, a thing you can buy, that you just have a weakness for, and you have to get it when you see it? For me, I think that item is a Kirby blind box. I love that little round pink blob, and the blind boxes I find of Kirby are usually surprisingly high quality and really nice looking. and now as a result, I've got a small army of Kirbys, waiting for their moment to strike. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you learned something. So, see ya.